To understand exposure, we need to take a look at the three aspects of exposure, which are shutter speed, aperture opening, and your sensitivity, or your what's called your ISO or your ASA. And so I'm going to kind of talk about all three of those in this first video, and then I'm going to break out some other clips that talk about those specifically here. So we're opening up with this shot of Julia in a kayak here, and this is pretty well exposed in terms of shutter speed and aperture, and we're shooting this at 100 ASA, okay? And really, for us to determine exposure, this is something that you need to train your eye by. For example, if I open up with this image instead, you might think, well, I'm hoping you would think that that is a touch overexposed. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on, what that looks like, and to train your eye to get into what's happening between those two. Let me talk about that one more time. Here's the one image, and then the image that's about a stop and a half, maybe two stops overexposed there. And you see what happens in terms of the color becomes desaturated within that. We are able to pick up more detail and shadow, but we lose its richness as compared to what we have going on there. So let's talk about those three axioms as they come together here. And this is kind of a graphic illustration of what you might see inside your camera's viewfinder, or on the, if you have a mirrorless camera, on your little screen on the back of the camera. And there are a number of numbers represented here. The first number, the 125 number, is your shutter speed, and so this particular one is set at 1/25th of a second. The second number, the 16, represents an aperture opening, one of many, okay, like the shutter speed's one of many. Our aperture opening here is represented at a 16th, or an f16. And then over on the far right, we have the third variable in exposure, and that's the ISO or ASA. ISO standing for International Standard Organization, and ASA standing for the American Standard Association. Back in the day when film was being created, there was a need to standardize the emulsion sensitivities of the types of films that were being brought to market. So photographers knew that at 100 ASA in broad daylight, that an f8 could be shot at 1/500th of a second, for example. And at 200 ASA, that's going to change, and 400 ASA, and so on. Well, those numbers don't mean much to us anymore because we're not really dealing with film. We're not dealing with a chemical emulsion that's light sensitive. We're dealing instead with a sensor. I'll show you a sensor here in just a minute. So while it might sound arbitrary, these numbers really kind of go through and pinpoint to the amount of sensitivity that your pickup sensor has, as illustrated maybe by the amount of sensitivity of our emulsion anyway. So there are three numbers there. And you see on the top that as someone went through and tried to go through and set this exposure, you see those that range of numbers in the middle. That's the light meter, and you might see it represented horizontally like this, or you might see it represented vertically within your viewfinder. But you have a -1, a -2, a -1, and then a center point, and then a +2 and a +1 as it goes from left to right. And then you have little indicators in between there as well. You see that the exposure icon, which is the bar that's underneath the triangle right in the middle there on the top one, on 1/25th of a second at an f16 at 200 ASA or ISO, that's pulling in a perfect exposure, meaning that your highlights and your shadows are balanced out within your image, and you can go through and release the frame. Now, if we were to open up the camera, okay, open up the aperture by one stop by an f11, there as it's represented there next to the 1/25th of a second, f11 in the middle row, you see that that icon, that exposure icon, the bar, goes to a +1, because now we're overexposed by one stop, and that would look like much like the second image of Julie in the kayak, right? And then if we go down to the last row there on where it's an f22 at 1/25th of a second, you see that that bar has shifted one stop underexposed. So we would go a little bit darker in that respect. So let me illustrate that to you. Here's a shot of another friend of mine who kayaks. His name is Matt. And this is 2 stops underexposed. This is 1 stop underexposed. This is proper exposure. This gets into 1 stop overexposed, and then 2 stops overexposed. Okay, let's look at those one more time. Let me go cycle through that so you can see how that works. Okay, underexposed by 2, underexposed by 1, fully properly exposed, 1 stop overexposed, 2 stops overexposed. See how we're losing our richness, our contrast and what's going on? The colors become a little bit more saturated as opposed to now we get it more saturated. We're still overexposed because the highlight on his face is just a little too hot. Now we're getting there. And probably a little too hot for my taste there, but the camera goes through and says, that's about right. I like things a little underexposed, somewhere between that one and this one is where I would have my preference with that. But you can see how colors become more saturated as we get underexposed, but then we lose highlights within that as well. Now I've been shooting for 40 years, okay, and I've developed an eye in terms of being able to go through and just tell in my mind's eye what's off in terms of exposure and by how much. I'm not expecting that of you. I am expecting you, though, to use your camera's tool of the light meter to go through and determine what is proper exposure. Now, there are 3 different types of light meters these days in most cameras that are out there from your Canon Rebel on up. And they will go through and you could select what kind of metering you want to have. Now each one of these rectangles represents your field of view as you're looking through your viewfinder, okay? And the histograms beneath each of those goes through and shows how much weight is given to that area within that field of view in terms of metering. So we have an average metering with that center weighted on the left, and then we have less than average metering, more centered, okay, and then we have spot metering on the right. So if I wanted to spot meter a specific subject, say for example, in this image here, if I wanted to spot meter the tent and pull the exposure off that specifically, I would put my camera in that spot meter, put the center of it right there, meter that, and set up my camera to go through and record that light coming out of the tent and then reframe it to go through and get the rest of the shot. Okay, that's how that's done. Metering happens then as your camera's pickup device goes through and determines how all of the pixels within that pickup device are being hit by light. It'll go through, and if you're in automatic mode or program mode, it will go through and automatically set your aperture and your shutter speed to go through and optimize getting the best exposure. And in program mode, in fully automatic mode, it will also set your ISO to go through and compensate to get the best image that you have. We'll get into film sensitivity and the trade-offs there because especially shooting as a photojournalist, we want to keep our film sensitivity, our pickup device sensitivity as low as possible, like around 100 ASA. 400 ASA is acceptable these days, and in fact, there's some great sensors that are out there to where you could shoot at 800 and maybe 1600 ASA and still get away without having a whole bunch of graininess induced into the image. This image, going back to the tent and that background, is probably shot at a 100 ASA to get that kind of clarity to get into. So that's pretty much it in terms of exposure, working with those 3 variables in terms of your shutter, in terms of your aperture, and in terms of your ISO setting, your sensitivity setting. But we can't really leave exposure without talking about what's called the high dynamic range. And this is where there are cameras that have the ability to go through and shoot high dynamic range just within the camera itself. Other high dynamic range is achieved in photoshopping or in some other type of digital darkroom application to go through and do so. When a camera is set up to do high dynamic range, it actually shoots 3 to 5 different photographs that span that exposure range. So it'll start off 2 stops underexposed and go 1 stop underexposed, and then go proper exposure, 1 stop overexposed, and then 2 stops overexposed. And then within all of those images, then it takes the dynamic range of each of those and smashes them all together into one image that looks like this. Okay, you see the crispness of this. You see the definition in both the highlights and shadows within this. This does something that the human eye really doesn't do very well. Okay, it really isn't all that capable of in terms of being able to maximize exposure range, that dynamic range that's happening throughout the entire photograph. Here's one more sample of that. Okay, so this is without the high dynamic range. We're not seeing a whole lot of contrast going on here. The colors really aren't popping a whole lot. It's just not very dramatic. The water especially, I wanted to pull out a lot more dynamics, maybe drama into that to go through and capture this. This is my spouse kayaking, and we're out in the middle of wintertime kayaking on a lake. So the high dynamic range does that. Okay, it pulls in those contrasts while it pops those highlights there. It gives us some more shadow and definition, and it pops the colors and brings us out. So while we're talking about exposure, high dynamic range isn't something that we really use in photojournalism because it might have a tendency to go through and start to editorialize. And that's one thing we don't want to do. We're already editorializing by the frame of our image, by how we frame it up. If you go through and start changing things like contrast and we get into high dynamic range, then we might get away from the truthfulness of the photograph. Okay, so this is part one. Make sure you pick up the other 3 parts to this on this series on exposure.